Good afternoon, guys. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jared Grigas, and welcome to the 2024 FLERA Legislative Session Recap. We are live from FACTS Studio 67 headquarters here in Tallahassee, Florida, just a couple blocks away from our state capitol, where a couple weeks ago they adjourned sine die from the 2024 legislative session. I am joined today by Ms. Diana Ferguson, who is the Executive Director of FLERA. How you doing today, Diana?
Doing great.
Doing good. Well, I know many of you were expecting Jeff Scala to be joining today. However, fatherhood calls, and so we had to shuffle things around a little bit. But next man up, and we'll have a good time talking about this. This was a legislative session that saw over 1,900 bills filed in total, with 325 making it across that final finish line. FAC was tracking over 400 of these in total, and obviously, a handful of the big ones. Fizzled out here and there to our, I guess, pleasure in some cases. Playing a lot of defense, but obviously we will get right in the swing of things. As usual, water is kind of the lifeblood of our state, so we will let you kick things off in that space, Diana.
Good deal. Okay, perfect. Let's talk about Senate Bill 7040, which ratified the Department of Environmental Protection's updated stormwater rule. And this was the last activity that had to occur following the passage of the Clean Waterways Act in 2020. That bill directed DEP and the water management districts to do lots of different rulemaking revisions and upgrades. And the last one that still needed to be ratified was regarding stormwater infrastructure. Those bills have now been ratified. That we worked with a team of folks to help get those across the finish line. Because even though there was a technical advisory committee that met for a couple of years, some of the stakeholders just were kind of late coming in with requests for amendments that involved, for example, grandfathering projects where a lot of money had been invested and a lot of time had been spent. And while those were, reasonable issues, they had to be worked through very quickly in a very technical way. And some of the initial rounds of amendments were just drafted by folks who maybe didn't understand how land use would interplay with all of this. And so it took a team of technical experts to kind of get in there very quickly and work to redraft all of those so that the rule still has a good amount of positive impact, but also protects those folks who have maybe kind of, gotten pretty far through the process with an existing project. So we're very pleased that passed, very excited about it. And that is the last thing that we had to do to really get that Clean Waterways Act implemented. So very good effort there, very good team effort for sure.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, a lot of cooks in the kitchen there, but good that we're comfortable with the final product here.
I think so. I think a lot of stakeholders wanted to see more, but that's how negotiation works. So I think we got a pretty good product in the end. Next one is Senate Bill 1532 regarding mitigation. And this bill expands the water quality enhancement program that was created last year to allow private entities to purchase credits and participate in it. Now, the bill as it was filed was very broad, and there were lots of folks expressing concerns. The mitigation bankers, their association, actually took the lead on negotiating some technical amendments and some things to kind of put some guardrails on that and make it better. And the end product was a lot more narrowly tailored and much less concerning. So that's going to be, a tool in the toolbox going forward. Did you want to take the lead? Jeff was going to do the DEP bill. Do you feel like you can?
Sure thing. Yeah. So this was the DEP's agency package for the year 2024. And among other things, the bill required that each water management district initiate rulemaking for reclaimed water. We certainly like our rulemaking in this space, obviously. And so we'll look to see that completed by about December 31st, 2025. Additionally, it expanded the types of projects that may be awarded through the Resilient Florida Grant Program. Specifically, it allows local governments to, I believe it expanded it to include adaptation plans and then updating the critical asset inventory within those counties. Beyond that, there were a handful of provisions on septic tanks, clarifying that the transfer of the on-site sewage program from DOH to DEP be completed in a phased approach, as opposed to sort of an all-at-once, bite. It requires DEP to adopt rules establishing and implementing a program of permitting for septic tanks and on-site sewage treatment and disposal systems, as well as requiring DEP to establish nutrient-reducing septic tank approval program that will evaluate and approve the systems in this state. And then lastly, it requires DEP to create a water quality dashboard.
I would add a couple of things that aren't on the slide, just so folks are aware. The bill also created the Christian Jacobs Aquatic Preserve. And this never ended up in the bill, but there was some language shot to the bill that was in a standalone bill regarding the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. That ended up being fairly controversial. It was a controversy over the boundaries of the preserve, and there's apparently a marina down there that may not be able to be built because it's within the confines of the preserve. And so I don't know what will happen with that issue. It was a standalone bill. It was just something we were monitoring, but that's an issue that we may see come back. And I think, now we're going to see the creation of this new aquatic preserve, which up until a couple of years ago hadn't happened in a long time. But a couple of years ago, the Nature Coast Aquatic Preserve was created as well. And so we are seeing that program grow a bit. So I think that's really it in a nutshell, though.
And then we have House Bill 165 dealing with sampling of beach waters and public bathing spaces. This is by Representative Gossett-Seidman this session. And initially the bill would have transferred authority over bacteriological sampling from DOH to DEP. That ultimately did not make it in the final bill. Instead, it directs DOH to adopt rules relating to public bathing spaces and the bacteriological sampling. And the rules must address the issuance of water quality health advisories, as well as closure of these public bathing waters for a failed sample. As far as responsibilities for counties here, there were some certain notice requirements as well as signage that falls to the counties here. Specifically, it prescribed a notice process for counties should there be a water quality incident, a sample that goes above those thresholds. And then it requires the county to post a health advisory in any county-owned spaces following an incident.
You want to take that one, Jared?
Sure thing. So SB 1638 was kind of the big environmental resource funding package. Specifically, it was routing 96% of the 2021 Gaming Compact with the Seminole Tribes revenues toward conservation, water infrastructure, and land acquisition projects. The sub-allocations within this 96% are done by the lesser of either a formula, a statutory formula, or a fixed funding level. And so within that 96%, we're seeing sub-allocations to the Florida Wildlife Corridor, Resilient Florida, as well as a number of land management activities here. This is something that I know FAC has been, pushing for a couple of years in the form of kind of a water work plan is what we've been looking for. And the one thing I did want to note is that this doesn't exactly, we're very appreciative of kind of the dedicated funding within this bill. However, we have speculated that it's not necessarily supplemental to the existing funding sources, but could be replacing them in some cases. And so we'll just have to see what that looks like going forward. But, we're obviously very grateful for the dedicated funding for these water projects.
Okay, I see that we've got a question. We'll hold the questions till the end, and then we'll go back to whatever bills folks have questions on. So just kind of keep them coming, and we'll go back to those. So here are a number of bills that actually failed in the environmental space. Just going to touch on them real quickly. There was a mangrove replanting and restoration bill we've seen for the last couple of years that would have required DEP to do some rulemaking relative to mangrove replanting and restoration, and also to do a feasibility study related to how and whether mangroves could be used for some kind of flood insurance benefit. That is a bill that we've seen the last couple of years and just kind of doesn't seem to get the traction. Now this one, the next one was very controversial, the environmental management bill. And the bills were different throughout the process, but both kind of contain some of the same kind of major themes. So the thing that we followed for counties and for stormwater utilities is the slope provisions. Most folks are probably aware that there have been some incidents over the last couple of years where folks have gotten injured or even killed in stormwater ponds. However, those have not been because of faulty design. They have been because of a lack of management or maintenance. And so the bills really go back to how the stormwater ponds are designed and deal with the slope. But because there were 2 or 3 different versions of this, some of them had technical problems, and they would have actually prevented gentler slopes, which was definitely not the intent, and would have had lots of bad unintended consequences. So we had to kind of work with a team of folks to make sure all the legislators and the proponents working on these issues understood the technical aspects of it, and we got that fixed pretty easily. There was a bill on PFAS again, but again, didn't get traction. There's lots happening with that federally and even at the state level. And so I think that's not even an emerging issue now. It's kind of here, and there's going to be lots of tough issues to deal with on that, but it might take another year or two before.
Except from the EPA, yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Now, this next one on coastal construction and assessments was kind of a tricky one. It came from a controversy in Sarasota having to do with seawalls. But the language in the bill, while it preempted the DEP from delegating the Coastal Construction Control Line program, it also tied that to activities beyond the CCCL program. So if you didn't have delegation by a certain date, you could do certain things that were really above and beyond the CCCL program.
So it was catching additional zoning and local.
And I think it took folks a minute to figure out that that's what it did, because
Right.
it was very technical. So initially when folks read it, they were like, well, no one's asked for this delegation. Is this a problem? But it turned out it could be read to really preempt any kind of coastal setbacks, which would have impacted every coastal city and county. And I think, it was a team effort. Jeff, me, some other lobbyists kind of banded together to educate folks about it. And once we were able to do that, it really stopped it in its tracks, because I don't think that was ever the intention. It was just faulty drafting and maybe
Right.
just not enough time to figure out what was really going to come of that bill.
Yeah,
So
it lost momentum pretty quickly.
yes.
The Senate bill started off innocuous enough, where it
did. Yes.
expanded the Resilient Florida grant program to
That's
include
right.
saltwater intrusion vulnerability assessments. But as soon as the CCCL preemption was included,
Yeah.
the bill kind of came to a screeching halt there.
Yes, it did. We'll see what comes of all those issues next year. And the land and water management bill is something we've seen the last couple of years that I think we'll continue to see. Now, last year, it was a very broad preemption of local environmental regulations, and it would have been so broad that it would have really prevented local governments from meeting their legal obligations under state and federal law for water quality and other types of activities and requirements. This year's bill was more narrowly tailored, but it would have required local governments that have a buffer for wetlands that are more stringent than state requirements to acquire those through eminent domain. So that would have been very onerous and expensive for local governments. It also had a preemption of all dredge and fill activities to the state, and it would have repealed land management teams. And so still a very bad bill. We were more concerned about it this year because it was more narrowly tailored. We thought it might get some traction, but we were able to prevent that one from moving. Although I do think that wetlands preemption is something we've not seen the end of. We used to see it every year, years ago, and then kind of have seen a pause in that, but we've seen it return. And so I think, lots of preemptions always in the legislative session, especially of years late, but it's one that I think we will see come back.
Gotta love those repeat offenders. Moving on to more of a growth management perspective here, one of the big themes that we saw throughout this legislative session was kind of a deregulation campaign of the local building and permit review process. Starting off here, we got House Bill 267 dealing with building regulations by Representative Esposito. And this is one that FAC worked pretty closely with the sponsor throughout this session. Kind of where they were taking aim here was they were looking to tighten the shot clocks, so to speak, for a local building department to approve or deny a permit. I feel as this is almost a consensus issue where, obviously the local government has every incentive to want, to streamline the process as much as possible. But kind of where we had to stand in and say, no, was we had to keep an eye on kind of the technical and public safety aspects of what was going on here. So under current statute, most single-family residential dwellings have a 30-day review period with an additional 10 days to cure or to review once the applicant has cured any deficiencies that first time around. Most other permit types have a 120-day window here. And what the sponsor was looking to do was just slash these timelines kind of across the board here. Another component of this was looking to kind of privatize the process more. So we added a provision allowing for private providers to come in and conduct the plans review, conduct the inspection services, that sort of thing. And if a private provider were to conduct those services, it would be a 10-day review period for the local government. And without a standard audit procedure, we would be actually prohibited in statute from going back and then auditing that private provider's performance, so to speak. Beyond that, we saw a 30-day review for residential structures under 7,500 square feet, and then it was a 60-day review for those structures above 7,500 square feet. We kind of wanted to make that distinction, obviously, because the reviews are more complicated for larger structures. More going on. That 60-day window also encompasses non-residential structures, multifamily residential site plan and subdivision plat approvals, as well as lot grading and site alteration reviews. There's one last thing I want to touch on here, and that was kind of the big landmine that we were seeing, at least in the House bill for a while here. There was some language wherein a permit application would be deemed approved by default if we were to not meet any of those timelines in statute. And so obviously you'd potentially have shovels in the ground and buildings being constructed that have not undergone proper scrutiny, proper review. And that's just a public safety nightmare. And so we had a lot of talks with both sponsors, obviously, to make sure that did not make it into the final version. Where we landed instead, as far as a penalty for noncompliance with those timelines, was a 10% reduction in fee for the developer for each day that we would spill over those timelines. And so, in theory, after 10 days, they're getting a free permit. So we have every incentive to hit those timelines there without it being a public safety issue.
Well, you guys did a good job on that, because the bill as filed was very, very strict, and probably would have been almost impossible for a lot of local governments to meet the requirements of the bill the way that it was filed. And I know since COVID, there's been a real shortage of staff, and that's really sort of all over the place. So it's important that these types of bills don't exacerbate that and make it even worse. Like, we don't want to make the problem that we have already even worse. So,
well, if you make it too strict, what you're going to see is more denials of permits. So you're kind of just making it worse. I'm glad you brought that up, because one additional thing I wanted to touch on is we actually included a small provision that allows for those carryover funds from permit fees to be used for technology, used for kind of expediting that process, whether it's, machine learning, technology, anything that can kind of zero in and almost pre-review the applications for us, and then we kind of know where to look for the deficiencies.
Nice. Maybe our next webinar can be on AI
Yeah.
permit processing. Okay, next slide.
And then kind of building off that last one, we saw a similar process that actually the language had a lot of overlap throughout this session. This was Senate Bill 812, dealing with batch permitting for kind of large subdivisions. And what this would do is it would require counties of over 75,000 residents to create a two-step program for issuing up to 50% of building permits following preliminary plat approval. And kind of the thought process here is that once you've got a preliminary plat approved, very difficult to say, you've essentially got all the lines on the map drawn, basically. And the final plat approval is largely just administrative stuff, parcel numbers, that sort of thing. And so the idea is that the developer could then get shovels in the ground quicker, less carrying costs in the meantime for them. And so they're getting those building permits sooner. Once again, we kind of had to keep an eye on the public safety and technical aspects of what was going on here. And so we wanted a few things from them, including they obviously had to touch base with the utilities, make sure that, there were no conflicts there. And they're not allowed to sell any buildings that they build with these permits until they have final plat approval. They also had to indemnify the local government, obviously, and required a performance bond of up to 130%. One other thing that the developer side really wanted was they wanted to kind of codify an existing vested rights test once that preliminary plat is approved, wherein, we could not then go back and kind of change the rules of the game on them once they've kind of endured a certain amount of, obligations and expenses towards a project. So,
I mean, I think it goes a little further than codifying existing law, but here we are.
You are not alone in that sentiment.
Right. The other thing that I would add is that I don't know if we have any city folks, but the 75,000 is for counties. For cities, I think it's cities of population of 10,000 or more, and with 25 acres contiguous residential and ag. But yeah.
Next up, we got a preemption, kind of building off one from the previous legislative session. Senate Bill 1628, Local Government Actions, passed, and it was a follow-up to SB 170 from the previous session, which was in theory, supposed to be the preemption to end all preemptions. We are not seeing that thus far. But what this bill specifically did was, whereas 170 required business impact statements and created a cause of action for any local ordinances, that sort of thing. There were a handful of carve-outs in that initial 170 bill, among which was certain growth management activities by the county. Those were carved out from the requirements of that. This puts them back on the table to be subject to that business impact statement. Initially, it would have also created the cause of action for this as well, although that ultimately did not make it into the final version of the bill. However, they would be subject to the business impact statement component of that.
And that was another example of the associations really, leaning in to try to pare that bill back, because as it was filed, it really blew open the bill that passed last year. And it's much more narrowly tailored as it passed. So, minimal impact as compared to it really could have been detrimental.
They can't help but get greedy sometimes. Yeah. And then another follow-up bill that we saw this session was Senate Bill 328 dealing with affordable housing. This was also a follow-up to the Live Local Act from the previous year, and it kind of built off a handful of the zoning and land use provisions of that bill, among which it was a prohibition on local governments restricting the intensity of a proposed development below 150% of the highest floor area ratio currently allowed under the local government's land development regulations. One more thing, it provides the ability of a local government to restrict the height of development when the development is adjacent to 2 or more single-family residential use parcels with 25 or more units to 150% of the tallest building on any of those adjacent properties, as well as the highest currently allowed height for the property, or 3 stories, whichever of those components is higher. It does not allow for administrative approval when the proposed development is in close proximity to a military installation, specifically a quarter of a mile. Clarifies that local governments currently allowed density, height, and FAR. Does not include any bonuses, variances, or special exceptions that they have previously provided to other potential applicants. And it requires developments authorized under the Act to be treated as a conforming use even after the expiration of the development's affordability period and their applicable statutes. It modifies certain parking restrictions for qualifying developments located near transportation facilities, where that might in theory be redundant, I think is the thought process. And then it provides that the zoning and height preemptions in that Live Local Act do not apply to certain developments in the proximity of an airport.
Now, in addition to those bills, there were a number of other land use and development, development permit bills that were all kind of getting traction at the same time. And Live Local and the follow-up to Live Local in and of itself is so much, and it's going to take a while to figure out how all of that is going to work. But these bills in particular all had conflicting provisions in them. The Senate did a really good job this year, especially because some things happened last year where things, were inconsistent that passed, and we had to kind of unwind some of that this year. So the Senate, I think, did a really good job of leaning in and making sure that bills that had inconsistent provisions that didn't make sense when taken in conjunction with one another, that they didn't all move forward. And Senate Bill 1184 in particular is one that really would have been detrimental for local government land use and growth management. It would have changed definitions in the community planning statute that would have really upended decades of case law. It would have created lots of confusion. It was maybe a solution in search of a problem. And the other 2 bills just really had inconsistent timelines with some of the things in the Esposito bill, and would have thwarted some of the things in the affordable housing bill. And so with so many of these preemptions now moving forward every year, it's really important for folks to work together to point out, where there are inconsistencies or things that don't make sense, and to try to, bring everything in for a landing together. And one thing that I'm going to be working on over the summer, in particular, to land use and to development permits, is working with some of the kind of frequently interested reps and senators who like to file these bills to see if we can create a better process for coordinating on the front end, and hopefully maybe even having some of these conversations before committee weeks and sessions start, because I do feel like every year we're all just, we're playing whack-a-mole. We've got 6, 8, 10 of these bills that are all moving and different cast of characters involved. And it has been very difficult to get folks to coordinate. And so that's something we'll be working on.
It'd be nice to get out ahead of this thing for once.
We'll see if it's a goal.
And next up, we're just going to touch on a handful of kind of highlights from the budget that we saw this year. Once again, our state is kind of flush with cash, and so a lot of areas are getting the appropriations projects and the funding that they were looking for. Here's kind of a high-level overview that we've got here, and if you'll look, the natural resources, environment, growth, and transportation section stayed relatively steady. It actually got about a $20 million increase from the previous fiscal year. Oh wait, that's a decrease.
No, yeah,
tiny decrease. But like I said, that did stay relatively steady. Just a negative 0.09% decline from that previous year.
And part of the reason for that is some of the areas of the budget, like education in particular, there were bills that required more appropriations that we've seen year over year. Same thing with criminal justice. And so it was a tough budget year for the environment, but I think it actually worked out pretty well in the end. So I think we can go to the next slide, and we've got a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the high level budget issues in the environmental space. The one in particular that's of concern to FLERA members is the local government cleanup contracting, which has maintained a steady source of funding, but really needs to be increased. The Department of Environmental Protection requested that increase last year, and it was not granted by the legislature. And it's been sort of difficult to figure out why, but we are going to be working with some of the programs over the summer to do some legislative meetings to see if we can educate key policymakers and the folks that we know are going to be working on that issue next year, and hopefully get the department to request that increase again so that we can get that corrected next year.
Well, and that was in the FACT program this year as well. We obviously appreciate you guys bringing that to us, bringing that to our attention.
Just and we had a little bit of a chat about it this morning in terms of strategy and coordinating efforts, and that's another one we'll be working on over the summer to see if we could get a better result next session.
That is the hope.
That is it.
And that wraps us up for that 2024 session recap. We have attached a handful of, Chris, if you don't mind going back to the contact info real quick. We have attached both Diana's contact information as well as a number of the FACT staff members. So if you have any questions that are not going to be answered in the chat just now, if you think of anything later on, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Whether that's myself, Jeff Scala, or any of the other staff members, or Diana here. Do we have time for questions, I take it?
I think we do. We have one question. So if folks have other questions, please pop them in the chat. But Lisa Spadafina with Miami-Dade County asked if, could we maybe go back to the...
Is that dealing with the bacteriological sampling one?
Yes.
Okay, 165.
So the question is whether these new responsibilities on the part of counties, can that be done through the county health department, or is it solely on the county? That's a good question. I will double check this for you, Lisa, and I'll get back to you, but I don't think the bill specifies one or the other. And so I think as long as the county and the county health department are working together to make sure it gets done, it can probably be either way, but I will verify that for you because I don't know that the bill actually contemplated that. Although I believe that is part of the reason it didn't get transferred to DEP, because that really would have brought a new regulatory entity into play, and that would have made it more complicated. And so I think this is probably a better result in terms of just coordinating efforts, but I'll double check and ask that question and let you know for sure. No more questions. Really?
Quiet day.
Yeah, quiet day. Well, if nobody has any other questions, we can go ahead and wrap it up. If you think of anything else, just get with me, get with Jared, get with Jeff. We're all always happy to answer questions and enjoy working together for y'all. And we will be talking to many of you soon.
Sounds good. Diana, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jared,
and appreciate you guys tuning in.
We'll see you guys soon.
Y'all take care.
Bye, guys.